So welcome everyone. Thank you for virtually attending our talk. Much as we do love to give this one in person, we're going to give it a go in the virtual setting. So this talk is writing the abstract and manuscript for acceptance. I'm Kristen Rising. I am at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. I'm the director of the Center for Connected Care there, as well as an associate professor and the director of acute care transitions in the emergency department. My color commentary kind of buddy here is Judd Hollander, also at Jefferson. Lots of roles here: Senior VP of Healthcare Delivery Innovation at Jefferson, Associate Dean of Strategic Health Initiatives, and Vice Chair in our Department of Emergency Medicine. We're supposed to actually be, so Judd is also a kind of last minute joiner for me. This is a kind of my colleague, Anna Marie Chang, who many of you may know or know of at least, was supposed to be giving this talk here. This is actually an MRI of her brain from a couple of weeks ago. She has shared this all over Twitter, so is kind of fine and happy for us to share here, but had COVID very early on in COVID. Maybe this is a post-COVID complication, but has been, you see this kind of big white area below on the MRI here, had headaches and ringing in her ears for weeks. Ends up she had a large dural AV fistula, has just undergone her second round of embolization of that this week. So actually had that Monday, thought, yeah, maybe I'll give the talk with you on Wednesday. Yesterday was like, maybe I shouldn't give that talk with you. So Judd has happily joined in as a partner for this talk. This is her, you see on the left here for like just a moment of medical teaching here. So lots of blood flow. The message we got from here is we can't read in detail. Lots of flow on the left, too much flow on the left, much less flow on the right. And it turns out much less ringing in her ears now. So she's doing well, but won't be joining us today, unfortunately. For some disclosure, so I'm on the editorial board for both Annals of Emergency Medicine and Academic Emergency Medicine. Judd has no current relevant disclosures. He is a past president of SAEM and was a deputy director of Annals of Emergency Medicine for years. Also has probably one of the more extensive paper writing histories of anyone we might run into in emergency medicine, has over 600 papers published to date. So definitely has some experience with the topic at hand today. How this is going to work is I'm giving the majority of the talk as you'll see it on slides. Judd is the majority of the color commentary, will be kind of interjecting as he sees fit in between the slides, and also helping to moderate the chat and such to make sure that we are addressing any comments you have. Please do. We really like to make this interactive. We usually have you split out into small groups and kind of have a whole process of this to make sure that you're engaging. So as much as you want to interject with comments or questions or things, use the chat. We are going to actually try to make you participate from this virtual setting. So, you know, we'll do what we can here. Starting out first,
Can I interject first? I'm going to ask people who want to play nice in the sandbox with us to put the video on, because that way we will know that you are one of the people we could call on. You can feel perfectly good not putting the video on, but please notice that everybody else on the participant list will know that you have no guts and left your video off. And really, as Kristen says, this is your chance to learn. Like, the goal is to really teach you how you could sit down and write a manuscript in your free time and go through this. And people learn much better if they're engaged than if you just listen to us blabber at you. We've done this a bunch and we sort of know what works and what doesn't work. So I'll ask you to please throw your video on if you want. We will actually call on people and hopefully you guys will really learn a ton through this.
Judd will probably call on the people with their video off first too. So if it's one more incentive to turn on. So when we think about papers, right, a really important thing to think about way before you're writing the paper, ideally at the beginning of the project, really is authorship and authorship issues that might arise and kind of how to avoid them, hopefully. A first and key point is there are standard guidelines for authorship. And so when people come to you and say, oh, I really want to be on that paper, I'm the chair, I should be on that. Well, you know, there are actually standard guidelines that are put out. You need to actually be involved in some part of the kind of data generation or paper writing process to really be involved, right? So conception, design, conduct, analysis, and preparation of the paper. These guidelines do not include just always including the chair or the residency director, the fellowship director, whoever it may be. You actually need to have people involved in your project. And you really ideally will be clear about this from the initial IRB proposal onward. Sometimes there's someone who's late to the game to join because you actually realize you need some other input or involvement later on. You get stalled at some point. So, you know, someone comes in and really kind of helps with a late analysis or writing of the paper who may join. But otherwise, you really want to be clear from the beginning of their project. And a general guideline that, you know, I and Judd really both try to use is never leave out someone who did more work than someone who's included on the paper, right? Remember to think about and make sure you're including people, the students, the various people who have really been involved, you know, and not just your kind of senior leaders and other co-investigators. And so really be thoughtful about who you're including on your papers.
And that actually gives you a great out when somebody more senior and more powerful than you asks to do something that's entirely unethical. It is really to say, how do I add you when these 7 people did more work and the journal doesn't allow 14 authors for a single case report? It is a great way to open the discussion about what's learned in, you know, honestly, a relatively non-judgmental way, because the people who are being left off are also often in the same department and have the same leader, and it would create hostility. So I find that rule, A, makes me think about who I should include, and B, has helped out in times when there is a dispute in arbitrating, should you be on or should you be off. But at the same point, there are a lot of papers that I read over. There's one recently in the New England Journal that I was offered an authorship spot on. I had nothing to do with it. I read a complete manuscript and I declined, and I ended up not even being an acknowledgement. It took me 4 hours worth of work. That's not earning authorship. So lead by example too, and don't expect to be an author on things where you're not really an author, and then it's really easy to be pure.
All right, so we're going to work through with you today what we are calling the 20-minute paper concept. And when we think through this, we really want to actually, again, have you do this along with us. So right now, I'm going to ask you all who are willing at all to play in that sandbox to commit to a topic. Commit to a topic for what you're going to just, in very broad strokes, generate a paper outline for today, and type your topic in the chat. It doesn't have to be really detailed. You could be like, it's going to be COPD. It's going to be, you know, asthma. It's going to be AV fistulas. Whatever, you know, general topic you're committing to. Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Event management. Telehealth.
Right. Yay for telehealth, Kathleen.
Feedback in med ed, overcoming interoperability barriers, bronchiolitis, resident IOPs. Great, lots of variety coming back here. Resuscitation, leadership, stroke, impact of emotion on medical learning. Awesome. So if you haven't committed, like really do yourself the favor, commit to one. I think again, it just makes this practical nature much more useful for you. We, in a few minutes, are going to take about 3 minutes to sketch out an intro. And then in this concept, really, all of the sketching out results, you think like should be 2 minutes to sketch out the table 1, not actually what's in it, what like the numbers in it, but what would go into your table 1. 1 minute to think about what your main results are going to be, 2 minutes to drill down those results. So we'll kind of walk you through this process as we go.
Now think about this, all of you, because some of you picked topics that clearly you must know a lot about. They weren't like just a general thing. And so one of the things that I think people do wrong is they get too in the weeds too early. The single best thing I ever wrote, I literally wrote in front of TV with no references, because it was a topic I know a lot about, and I just said what I want to say and then retrofitted the references, rather than like when I started out and I had 800 articles printed out on my desk with yellow highlighting and I tried to put them together. So I want you to think big, because most of the time, if you're deciding to write something, you have a much better knowledge base about the topic than you probably realize.
All right, so thinking a bit, now that we've gotten the topics, we're a little already in that weed, but we're going to step back and just think about the overall. It's about the project design, how you approach everything. So before you write the paper, it's going to be really important to be clear on thinking about defining the problem. This is usually going to involve a literature review, unless again, you've kind of been doing that literature review for the last, year, and it's already in your head, as Judd is talking about. And you really want to be unclear about the unmet need. Like, why is your paper somehow, how and why is it adding to what exists and adding a new bit? See, and you want to be clear that there's something kind of there. And then you want to be designing a study that can address the problem. And this is always the really important balance, right? Like I've always been over and over, I heard in fellowship from initially Brendan Carr as well as Judd, like, do not let perfect be the enemy of good, right? You've got to balance the rigorous epidemiology kind of approach versus what you can do in the real world for the study. And that's very important to be clear about. If it's a little bit harder but feasible, go for the little bit harder. Usually it's going to be the better study, but at some point say, this is going to be good enough. And this is kind of what real world allows me. And then really it's about the project design at that point. Writing really cannot rescue a poorly designed project. You can't really cover up the holes of the things you didn't do, but bad writing can hurt a really excellent project. So you first got to make sure you're designing the project well, and then we're going to go about writing up the paper well. And this begins again, even really before that IRB. This is all the prep that you're doing. You want to make sure that there is an unmet need. You want to make sure that your methods are thought out, that you are balancing again that perfect with real world, and that you're taking a good approach. You want to define the data and the outcomes that are being collected. Make sure you're actually getting the data you need, so you don't finish the project a year later and realize like, oh gosh, there's this really key demographic bit I didn't collect, or an outcome that would have been so valuable. Think about your limitations, like really write that limitation section now, because you can fix some of them, right? You may realize there are going to be some inherent limitations to your study. There are also going to be a lot of things that like later it's a limitation because you didn't think about it, you didn't collect that data point, but you could have, so you can still fix it. You want to try to game theory your results some, and I'm sure Judd will have some more to say about this, but thinking about kind of what types of results you might see with your work and how they can inform kind of what your discussion might be for this. And take a stab, like in your ideal world, you write the paper now. Again, your results are going to change, are going to actually develop into what your results are, but you can write your whole background, right? Because you know why you're doing the study. You know what the problem is, you know the unmet need, you know the study you're designing, you know the methods you're using, you know what you're going to report in your table 1 and the primary outcome you're at least going to look for. And then you can, again, kind of game theory where you might be going with the discussion and really think about what that whole project will be.
Yeah, so this is Kristen's 100% right. This is where I feel really, really strongly. Your results, you only have 2 options. What you tried worked and what you tried didn't work, right? You have a pretty good idea, maybe 2/3 of the time that you're doing this because you believe it's going to work. You have to write your intro before the IRB because you have to make them think it's worth doing. You have to write your methods before your IRB. You have to tell them what data you're collecting. If you don't know what you're doing with the data, that's horrible, right? Then why are you collecting it? So you should write your results before the IRB because you don't want to get to the end of your study and say, oh, I forgot gender, right? Like that would be a horrible thing to happen. And we all know people that that's happened to just because they didn't put it in there. So I actually say, seriously write the whole paper. And I do this with almost every study. And it turns out to be a big advantage because your limitations at the end, I was a deputy editor for the Annals. I know half of the limitations are made up. Like we didn't study the whole world, so we can't say it exists in the whole world. We only did it at one institution. We don't know if it works at other institutions. That's a bunch of crap. What you really, it's true, but what you really want to know is what if you could redesign the study, what would you do different? This is the time to think about that, because then you could design a better study. And then I actually literally, most of my career, have written the whole paper at that point because I can write the discussion because it's the same literature I need for the introduction. And I just write, we found this. And I take through the analysis I want to do and I put in XXX or YYY for all my data. but I could still compare, and I could say Fieser found this and Coletti found this, and Barksdale found this, and this is how my study ties into that, because I have to think about how that's going to work. So do it all up front. And then a true story to illustrate the importance of doing this up front. And I pray this happens to all of you. This is just one of those days from heaven. Submitted an abstract to a late breaking session at the American College of Cardiology, and it got accepted. And I was pretty excited about that. It was on a randomized controlled trial for coronary CTAs in, ER acute chest pain before we had high sensitivity troponins. And after it got in there, I literally got a phone call from one of the editors of the New England Journal and said, we want to publish your paper at the same time you're presenting the abstract in 3 weeks. Can you send me a copy in the next 2 days? If I didn't have the paper already written, I couldn't do that. I had to tell them, we don't have the data yet. All I have it is with X's and Y's, but we believe our event rate is 0 in terms of deaths, but we don't know. And he literally told me, make up your best guess at the data, put it at the top of the thing and send it to me. And if you say it's perfect, and when you lock the database and have finalized data, it's not, even if we've accepted it, we may reject it. And over the next 72 hours, I had a paper without data accepted at the New England Journal. And luckily, we guessed right on what the hypothesis was. If I had nothing written, there was no way I was turning around a paper that was that good that fast. But we had already planned on submitting it there. And I already had done what we had a research in progress meeting where I had a whole bunch of smart people going over what Kristen's going to take us through for other things and saying, what points am I missing? What could I do better? Because you don't often do studies that you think are good enough to roll the dice at New England Journal or JAMA. And this one we thought was. So again, preparation made that come true. And it just illustrates the importance of it.
All right. So moving on here, let's talk about the introduction. Generally, I really stick to this almost all papers, and it really helps when I get people's papers and try to edit them down to think about like, gosh, this just seems all over the place. I don't quite get the goal of this. Like really think about this. A 3-paragraph approach. The first paragraph is really just, why should anyone care about this? And we'll dive into these in the next slides, but why should anyone care? The second paragraph, we get at that current state of affairs, and that's, again, the literature review, making sure you know kind of what we already know. And then the third is looking at the unmet need that you are solving. So let's just dive into these a little bit more. So why should anyone care? Generally, this is one of 2 buckets. Either lots of people have this problem, or it's a rare event, but really bad things happen, right? Like these are the 2 buckets that we're either like, gosh, this is a thing we face every single day, all the time, or like, oh my gosh, this doesn't happen much when it happens. Like this is just a disaster.
So
right?
Pause for a minute and think about the topic you put in the chat and ask whether it meets one of these 2 criteria and which would be your sales pitch. Okay, so Stephanie Stapleton, ventilator management, which do you think would be your sales pitch?
There she is, common.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we see it all the time. We don't do it well.
Right. Okay, so let's go for Kerry McCabe, impact of emotion on medical learning. Where would you put that?
Lots of people have this problem, but they don't even know that they have it.
Wonderful. And we'll get one more, Stephanie Carrero, pediatric cannabis exposure.
So it turns out, sorry, different person on the same line. When you smoke cannabis, you get a lower amount. However, when you ingest cannabis, you get a much greater amount. As up with all things with toxicology, the dose makes the poison. So things we would expect with low doses may not hold true when we get these massive doses from your edible exposures.
So you're saying rare event, or you're going with lots of people have this problem?
More for like an effect you wouldn't expect. So when everyone's familiar with like someone who's smoking cannabis, but so for some of the edibles, some of these kids we're finding they're getting respiratory depression, they're getting seizures. There's case reports of having some myocardial events. So lots of people could be having this problem at these higher doses.
So, or maybe, so may I offer a friendly amendment? Tons of people use cannabis, but a small percentage of people have this problem.
Yep.
Fair. Okay.
Very, very fair.
Okay, Kristen, back to you.
Yeah, all right. So then paragraph 2, this is our looking at the current state of affairs, our literature review. What do we already know? At this stage, it really is a summary of it rather than details, right? This isn't where you have got 10 different studies and you're saying so-and-so found this, so-and-so found this, much more a synopsis of what we know. And that ending with where are the holes in knowledge that are relevant to that, how you're going to fill that hole then, right? So you end that with some sort of the problem that then you are going to address as the unmet need in this study. Any commentary, Judd? No. All right, we're gonna.
Yeah, I guess I would just say this is the short and succinct. This is where you may say there have been 6 studies that showed this and 3 that showed this, and we think they may be explained by blah blah blah, and nobody studied blah blah blah. Whereas in your discussion, rather than say 6 studies, you might say author A et al. Found this and talk more in depth about the studies. At the beginning, it's just how do you take the studies in bulk, more a 10,000-foot view than in the weeds with each of the studies, assuming there's more than 1 or 2 studies on the topic.
All right, and then paragraph 3, we get to the unmet need. So you want to here have a good succinct framing of your study question. You do want to include the type of study it is, right? It's a retrospective review, it's a qualitative study, it's a randomized controlled trial. But what is the type of study and what is the main outcome you're looking at? Good to identify in this final paragraph of the intro, and then include some discrete objective or hypothesis depending on what your study is. A qualitative study doesn't have a hypothesis but has an objective you're looking at. Randomized controlled trial better have a hypothesis associated with that. I'm going to move on to this next slide, which is an example from Judd, which he can explain of how he went about outlining an intro for a paper.
So this, I saw we had Kathleen was interested in telemedicine, so we quickly pulled in a telemedicine study. No, that's actually just obviously what we had in here anyway. But this is literally what I did on an airplane, okay? My first paragraph was this from a couple of years ago. Healthcare is changing and customers are prioritizing convenience and one-stop shopping, right? That's why ERs do well. Growth in urgent care and retail, decreased primary care visits. This is my paragraph 1. Healthcare is changing. Lots of people are changing how they focus on it. This is, we've seen growth in urgent care, retail, decreased primary care visits. So we developed a telemedicine program. That's our unmet need. And then it's our main objective was to describe our initial experience. So this wasn't a hypothesis-driven study. It was way pre-COVID. It was 5 years ago when a lot of people weren't doing telemedicine. But this is the way I started. I started like 2nd grade. I said, what am I going to say in paragraph 1? What am I going to say in paragraph 2? What am I going to say in paragraph 3? And then I was on an airplane and then I took a nap and then I woke up and said, okay, let's write paragraph 2. And that's it. And this way, when I go through my whole paper and outline everything first, whatever I'm in the mood to write, I could then write, which is how on a trip to California and back, leaving out the references because they're too unwieldy most of the time, I could have a complete manuscript written because I go back to what you learned in 2nd grade and have an outline and then fill in the outline without the data. Then I'll get the data when I land and could sit at my desk for a couple hours and fill it in.
All right, so going back to this again is just outlining that 3-paragraph approach, ingrain it in your head. I know you started to address the kind of the first paragraph, but take, 3 minutes tops with the topics you have, or if you've suddenly decided like I'm switching that topic for whatever reason, your first paragraph convinced me I need to change. Switch your topic and just sketch this out for yourself. Give yourself a bullet or 2 for each of the paragraphs.
So we're going to take a 3-minute break and then we're going to ask you to put your paragraph in the chat. Not all of you, but we'll either take volunteers or call on 1 or 2 of you. So we get diverse representation of, I see there's a bunch of education studies and a bunch of, clinical studies, and just put it in there. You don't have to write out the whole thing, a sentence for each. So it will trigger your chain of thoughts would be what we're looking for. Okay, do we have a volunteer who wants to go first?
Yeah, this is Mohammed. I have written, I think, a couple of sentences.
Okay, go ahead and say them out loud.
So for the first paragraph, why should we care, right? Bronchiolitis is very common condition in children, which has a severe morbidity. And this is also a common cause of pediatric hospitalization.
Okay, pause there. Does that work for people? Does it convince you, if you care about this, that it's a relevant condition? I would say yes, right? So that's, you bring people in. Go ahead, Mohammed.
So paragraph 2, current state of affairs. Children with bronchiolitis are being treated as asthma, and there are no effective available treatments.
Good. And so then you would put some references to that.
Correct,
So
yes.
that it's true, of course.
And the third paragraph, we want to perform randomized controlled trial studies comparing a new treatment with the saline nebulization in children who visit emergency department with clinical diagnosis of bronchiolitis.
Terrific. Perfect. Who wants to go next? All right, we're gonna just call on a random person.
I can go.
You go? Okay, go ahead, Paul.
All right. So I guess my topic was mental health screening in the ED. So first sentence, although it is recognized that mental health disorders are associated with higher rates of ED utilization and poor quality of life. I'm going to put it in the chat real quick. Higher rates of ED utilization, poor quality of life, universal mental health screening is not standard in many emergency departments. Prior work has shown that up to, and I don't know the number off the top of my head, it's like probably like 35, between 35 and 45% of ED patients have undiagnosed or comorbid psychiatric disorders which remain undiagnosed after discharge. It is possible that early identification of these mental health concerns and provision of appropriate resources would reduce strain on emergency services, increase their access to high value care. This observational study seeks to assess the prevalence of anxiety and depression in a broad sample of ED patients and its effects on ED utilization and recidivism.
Okay, so this is going to illustrate, I think, a really critical point. If we go back to, I don't know if Paul's doing this study or not, but it sure sounds like he did, right? That just sounds like he read a paper, which illustrates the point that when you take this algorithm, it's really easy to do it. Paul, did you cut and paste that from a manuscript you're working on, or you just came up with that?
No, this is one that we're actually doing right now, and so it was easy for me to kind of pull on why I think it's important, why I'm doing it in the first place,
okay,
and kind of sketch it out.
Good.
So it's easy for me to mock it up.
Good. Okay. Do we have one more volunteer, and then we'll turn it back to Kristen to keep going?
I think there was one from Stephanie, not actually Stephanie, in the chat also here.
Oh, Stephanie, but not Stephanie. Okay, go ahead.
So this is my fellow Eric's paper. So he's working on a study on edible cannabis exposures in pediatrics. And so we're sort of, this is actually really well timed because he just submitted his IRB for this. So we're sort of talking through writing the paper for him now. So edible cannabis exposures are overall common, but pediatric exposures are less common. We are seeing kids come in with serious adverse effects though. So the current state of affairs is there's limited and retrospective data, but no prospectively collected data on this. So so his study is going to be a prospective observational study to collect that data.
Perfect. So this is like, this is 3 papers that we just saw that didn't really exist before that, you guys can put together pretty quick following this algorithm. Okay, Kristen, take it away. Keep going.
Yeah, great. So thinking about the methods, you want to provide enough detail for the reader to roughly reproduce the study. And at this stage, generally don't handicap the reviewers. Sometimes you really get stuck if you're at like a super, short word count for a kind of limited, size paper. But in general, tell the journal what they need to know to decide about the paper. They can always tell you to remove things. They can't know what you don't tell them, and you really don't want to make them guess about what you did. You win or lose here in terms of convincing first the editors who decide, am I even going to send this out for review? And then the rest of the paper reviewers, is this of value enough to consider publishing in our journal?
It doesn't get a paper published to say, this is really important. I'm sorry, I did a crappy study. It's all about doing a good study. I have actually had appeals when I was with Annals that said, this is really important. I spent a lot of years of my life working on it, and it's really important to me. And I know we screwed up the methods, but can you publish it anyway? Like that's just not the approach. Get the methods right.
Yeah. Also in the methods, journals give you a structure for a reason, right? Most journals will tell you either the specific headers to use in the order or a general structure, and it varies per journal. If you don't care about their structure, they generally aren't going to care about your submission. They also vary per journals, and as you start to go in between journals of different specialties, they're going to realize like you just didn't bother to restructure it, right? We see this all the time between Annals and Academic Emergency Medicine of like one versus the other. Give the time to actually structure to the specific journal that you're submitting to.
Which is a whole separate question from how moronic is it that you can't just take the same science and send it to another journal. And if you want to see, I got a whole long rant on Twitter about stupid things journals make you do about a month ago. So I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying that we're just saying this is reality.
Yep. Yep. The general approach, though, take out any sort of structure of a specific journal. The general sections that you want to make sure that you have the study design. I see many papers where people kind of forget to name it and just dive into here were the inclusion criteria and forget the overall, like, again, this is the design of the study. So the design and the setting are important to lay out. Include information on the participants and the patients. What were your inclusion and exclusion criteria? Methods of data collection, any interventions if it is an interventional study, the outcomes and citations when you can of kind of justifying their use, right? We used 3-day returns. We used 9-day ED returns. That's the one that's going to win me when I'm reviewing the paper. We use 30-day returns, but like, why do you pick different things? And is there any justification that you have for them? And then what is your approach for the primary data analysis, right? So these are the general sections. I want to make sure we get through all the slides. So we're just going to give you like 2 minutes here, but do yourself the favor. Let's take another 2 minutes. And for yourself, write out these bullets of what you are generally going to have for the paper for each of these sections that you've been outlining out.
You're right, because we're running low on time. We only got about 12 minutes left. We should skip ahead. But you get the concept. Yes, most of you have probably gotten halfway through it already. Half of you are looking up at us, so we see you did it or you faked it, and it's really quick when you get down to the second grade outline style.
All right, so when you think about the results, I think really for me, the main point of this is it is just the facts. Do not give your interpretation. Interestingly, surprisingly, like those aren't just give the facts and the results. Begin broad and drill down to your study population. This is thinking about like what your figure 1 would be usually, right? We approached or had kind of this many eligible. We approached this many for inclusion. Ultimately, we included this many. Then you want to be given after that your patient population description. This is usually your table 1. Sometimes people will have tables that are, describing their methods or whatnot, but this is usually the table 1. You give the demographics and the relevant features of your population. Divide this into study groups if you had study groups and you're comparing any major features across the group. Then after that, right, so you've got what was the population, who did you include, your overall main outcome comes next, and then your secondary outcome. So we clearly lay out your primary outcome. This should be like not a question. People get what your primary outcome is in the intro, in the methods, in the result. It's very clear. And then you can take a deeper dive into any sort of data-driven explanations of findings, not interpretation yet, but data-driven explanations.
And I'll just say from Kristen last week or 2 weeks ago, Kristen, I, and Anna Marie Chang are working together on a study that really, Kristen is leading, and her project coordinator, who is great, got all this interim data and put us on a phone call to discuss how to interpret it at an interim analysis. And, after we're on the phone for 45 minutes, I realized what was wrong with this is we had no idea how the hell to interpret it. She was just showing us data. It wasn't structured in the manner where we would write our paper first and want to know how this data answers our question. And at the end, once we realized this, Chris and I said, let's not look at this data anymore. Let's write a paper and then fill it in with data, because we don't want to be data mining and just looking for stuff. This is an NIH funded study. There's millions of dollars being spent. We have a very clear hypothesis. Why are we wasting our time looking at random pieces of data just because they're in a beautiful table? Let's go back to the way we do this. And it makes our life much simpler if you approach it that way. Every journal editor, every reader wants to know, who did you study, right? That's table 1. What did you do? That's figure 1. And then what are your main results? After your main results, if you have enough people in it, and you want to cut them into, male and female or different races, or drill down and see why you have things, then go ahead and do that. But that's the last step in the process. And really critical, decide what you're doing first, work with this funnel, go through this process, then look at the data.
I'll just correct everyone to say, I was not trying to let the data drive. I'm also a co-investigator on that study, and I 100% agree with Judd.
Yeah.
So yes, be clear about your question, then look at the data to answer the question, not, use it to generate your questions. So your discussion here, for the discussion, get in and get out. Don't take a wandering discussion that's like, a couple pages long. Generally, you lose people, you lose your primary points. Less is generally more for the discussion. You do want to start your discussion with a little replication. So clearly state the primary findings in that first paragraph. Among our sample enrolled, we found that XYZ of whatever you're looking at. Then you want to, frame your results in the context of prior knowledge and the unmet need. This is where you can take a little bit more depth than the intro on relevant past studies. You're probably going to call out some specific studies and what they found, how those findings actually are replicated or differ from your study. And then you want to fit your findings into that context, explore why things might be different, talk about the importance of them kind of, replicating or strengthening the findings of prior work. And generally, you can assume the reader knows the topic overall. They're not going to know in the same depth you do probably, but you don't really need to define diseases and such down here. Save your writing for actually the kind of more in-depth discussion around your findings. You definitely do want to include in your discussion as well, highlighting new knowledge that has been generated from this and what those future next steps might be in the future directions, right? What is that next unmet need or where you need to go, and set yourself up for that next paper and that next project that you're going to be doing.
Yeah, and Stephanie has a question in the chat from the last one that I'll read. Was last slide was just give an example, a deeper dive into data-driven explanations. I'm making this up on the fly, but imagine you do a study where you're looking at diabetics and it's negative, but then you partition your diabetics on hemoglobin A1C, and 2/3 of your population had a hemoglobin A1C less than 6. And some percent were over 9, and it looked like it works in the people who are 9. Well, that wasn't your hypothesis, but then looking over your data and partitioning those subgroups, you see something that generates a hypothesis for another study. Does that help? Yeah, okay, good.
Limitations, don't forget to include limitations. Many journals will tell you where. Sometimes they want limitations before the discussion. Sometimes they want them the end of the discussion. But share any study design limitations. Discuss how they may have biased the study as well for the positive or the negative. You can often think about how we had 80% women in the study. How might that have biased it? We had, 5% minorities, like that definitely, right? Like think about how both the design, the population, that everything that you have in your study, how it might be biasing your results and your generalizability across other populations.
Now, I know this is being recorded, so I want to be careful when I say this. You need to point out the relevant limitations. If you write 3 pages of limitations, you've just told me as an editor, I shouldn't publish your study because you yourself know it's horrible and you have 3 pages of limitations. So, but you also want to, because some of your limitations may be real, but you may have found a positive effect and your limitations may have biased it towards a negative effect, making your study more powerful. So not just the limitations, but what impact it would have on results. And then some of the limitations can help you. But if you know there's a limitation that reviewers are going to get, then you're better off identifying it and talking about it, which means leave out the general limitations that we're only one hospital and we're only one health system, and talk about the more important limitations that impact the results of your study. Because no one's going to reject your study because you're one hospital. They'll say, add that to the limitations, and you'll add it to the limitations. But if you leave out something really important, they're going to think you're either disingenuous or you don't understand that that's a limitation, and that does impact how they view your work. So this is, again, the same thing. We're running out of time. I write my limitations, and then I could put it into sentence form or paragraph structure later. Kristen, next slide. Same way we did with the intro. And same way we did with the intro. And now we could keep going on that.
Final part of your paper. So generally 1 to 2 sentences, maybe 3, not more than that though. What is your conclusion? Just what you conclude. It's got to be what you studied. I see this often. There's like the primary thing, and then like the author's actually like, oh, that was a mostly negative study or not that interesting. There's this one side thing, and the conclusion is just about that. Like it's got to be actually what you were studying. And then add maybe a future studies. And maybe that's where that kind of really interesting side thing fits in for in the future, we need to look at this area. But have that, again, building your next paper or your study, or where you might be going with this, of what's that next hole that you've now created. For references.
I was just going to say, there's one word you should avoid, probably in your intro and almost definitely in your conclusion. And that's the word pilot. Like if you're doing some fancy genomic study, and you're looking at, sequencing DNA, then maybe it's okay to have a pilot study. But most of the stuff we do doesn't deserve a real pilot study. And so if you're going to look at the relationship between LFTs and gallbladder disease, which Lord knows we've published a ton of times, and there's not really a big relationship, doing a pilot study on something that's been published in real studies isn't useful. Doing a pilot study that won't answer the question just to prove a resident could do a study doesn't answer it. It's either got to live or fly on its own. It doesn't get you extra points to say it's a pilot study. Again, it's acknowledging it's not a real study. It doesn't help you.
And then references, really work to cite the primary sources. It's best to not cite, unless really the point is there's been this whole review. If you're pulling something out of like a specific fact, point something out of a review article that was from a primary source, go back to that primary source and make sure it's cited right, and really cite that primary source. I've had it a number of times when I go back and actually the interpretation or what they looked at actually isn't really represented in that source. So kind of go back to the source. It usually it's not the right thing to be citing review articles, textbooks, white papers. Sometimes it is though. Sometimes you want those systematic reviews that were done. And then format them correctly. This is another thing, back to each journal has its own. There are a lot of different citation formats, and people care and have different ones that they want per journal. Format them and use a reference manager. And if you don't know what that means, like reach out to us, or kind of go ask the researcher at your, in your department that you kind of work with or know of that's written some papers, and say like, reference manager, what do you use and what should I be using? Don't be inserting these yourself. There are programs to be doing that for you, and they fix all of your formatting for you.
So we have a bunch of silly slides coming up, but we only have like 2 more minutes. So I think I'd rather take questions from you if you have questions than go through some of the silly slides at the end, although they're kind of cool. Just turn on your mic and you know, go ahead and ask, yell it out.
In answer to the reference manager, and I see someone answering which is least painful to use, I've used Mendeley for years. Actually, the latest update onto my Mac has made it not awesome for me, so I may switch, and institutionally we use EndNote here. I have been an EndNote or a Mendeley proponent though, and I think actually still on PCs, it's great for people. I see Zotero, which is similar kind of in its Mendeley, it's open source, it's free. But the main ones I hear of people using are Mendeley, Zotero, EndNote, and then because some institutions have access to them, RefWorks. I've never used RefWorks personally.
And I'm going to take Jim Holmes' comment here because it's 100% true. That Jim actually adds in that when you cite a secondary source who referenced the primary source, i.e. you're citing a textbook that says somebody said this in the original paper, that's not what the original paper said a decent amount of time. And so please do go back and look at the original papers and make sure they're saying what you think they say. Because you will have reviewers that go back and do that, and nothing killed. One of the things reviewers and editors do is they don't have your database, they're not running your analysis. So it's, do they believe what you're representing to be true? And if they find things that aren't true when they check references, then it becomes hard to have confidence that the data you're representing is right. So little things like citing references that don't say what you say they say destroy confidence for the journal in wanting to publish what you claim is true. So I think to our bottom line, you know, to wrap up here, is it's all about preparation up front, really tight methods, get in, get out, crisp presentation, select the right journal. Don't send everything to the best journal possible. If it's not going to get in there, it wastes your time, and many of you, if not most of you, are reviewers. You know, that's another thing where I got a rant you could enjoy on Twitter about how academic medicine makes everybody do everything for free. And then we all complain we don't have wellness and we're stressed out, but we're helping not for our society journals, which I do believe in, but there's a lot of for-profit journals that are making money off the backs of academicians who just keep doing stuff for free, believing it enhances promotion. So I try and submit things to a journal that it has a shot at getting into, but is maybe a little bit of a reach, but I don't want to waste reviewers' time, because I don't want people wasting my time on things that really have no shot at getting in someplace way above the bar. So do a real analysis of your paper and say, where is a good fit? And remember, it's not about you, it's about the project. The project doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter how hard you worked, you either did it well or you didn't, and now it lives or dies. So I have found, as we've emphasized through all of this, that if we start out realizing if we want it to be in a really good place, do it really well from the beginning, then you have a shot. Doesn't mean you don't get beat up. You can get beat up and you can be really disappointed. And I've been there more times than I care to count. I got, you know, Kristen said I got gobs of publications. Well, you know what I got 3 gobs of? 3 gobs of rejections. Yeah, you know, so, but it's not personal. It's whoever you got just didn't like it as much as they like something else. But the more you prepare, the better chance you have. It's interesting that the most chats we got was on reference managers, I think.
Mm-hmm. Feel free at any point to reach out to us if you have, you know, questions or any follow-up on this. Hopefully this was helpful to you. Great to see you all next time, hopefully in person somewhere.
And the only thing I'll add to Kristen's last concluding comments are, one of the most difficult things you'll have in life is where we started. If someone's bullying you to become an author on your paper, that actually honestly reach out to me and I'll help you through. I think that we as a society don't do well if we let people take advantage of junior investigators. And as someone who's published a lot, I do believe that I've never been on a publication that I haven't met authorship with. And I have had the really tough conversations with people really, really senior to me. And we've ended up where I've both kept my job and they've sent me letters of apology for trying to insert themselves in being authors. And so I can help you go through that process. And I think, good luck doing all of this. Hopefully we gave you a simple template and it'll make you productive, and have a great rest of the SAM meeting.